thank you so much for being here. Thank you for being here, and thank you for that great introduction. So as you heard, I work at a company called Nebulock. This is my sort of introductory slide. Eagle-eyed among you will notice my beloved hometown of Chicago in the image there. And I have been in startup space working in machine learning in various ways for 10 years now, probably. And before that, I taught sociology at the university. These are specific sort of elements of my background that come together in the topic that I'm talking about today a little bit. But first, Nebulock, you heard in the explanation that it's agentic threat hunting. What that means is that we provide cybersecurity experts with tools to better protect their organizations by using agents to comb through the logs, SIM records, system behavior, system patterns, all kinds of things that could be hiding malicious behavior or things that you don't want happening in your network, right? So that's what Nebulock does. And what my role is to help us to construct the models that can sort of parse through all of that data and to surface the insights that the customer actually needs to protect their networks. As you might expect, because we're in cybersecurity, and we're using agentic AI, making sure that it works and really evaluating the quality of what's going on is really, really important to us at Nebulock and important to me personally in my practice in general. So that's one of the reasons why I'm talking about this today. But to get started, LLM evaluation is not necessarily a given in a lot of organizations. I've worked at organizations where I kind of had to go and tell, we should actually evaluate whether our LLM that we're deploying in front of customers is actually doing what we think it should do. And my opinion is that you only need evaluation if you care if it works. If you don't care if it works, then I'm not sure what you're doing here, but don't bother building evaluations. However, you are investing your time, your money, your energy, your staff resources into building something for a reason. There are some organizations out there who are just build something with AI and it'll be fine. This is not really, that's not the way I would recommend going about these things. But if you do care, if what you're building and spending your resources on is actually delivering on the business goals that you have, that's when you need to evaluate. And as I talk about this a lot, we think similarly to the old software engineering practices. We'll have unit tests. We'll have the things that we test in the sort of development stage, and we'll just deploy it and it'll be fine. This is non-deterministic work. This is non-deterministic code that does not always behave in production the same way it did in testing. And this, lots of those of us from old school machine learning will understand this in sort of a general way. You need to evaluate it in production because you can't assume that it's always going to do the same thing every single time. You could see unusual data in the production setting, and the wild things behave funny. But also, an LLM is going to be a little bit different every time you prompt it, even if it's the same prompt, even if everything else is the same. And so you need to be keeping an eye on it because it's not necessarily going to be trustworthy, let's say. I also want to make a point for those of us who are in the business context with using LLMs that if you're not testing, your customers are the guinea pigs, right? If you're not doing testing and evaluation of your model, you're just waiting for your customers to notice this did something weird. And then you are, sort of breaking down that trust relationship and that confidence with your customers in you. So instead of just letting your customers be the testers, you should be doing that testing and doing that evaluation in your development process and in your production setting. So, what we're not discussing today, there are a few things. And it's just, I want to highlight that these things are still important. They're just not what we're going to talk about right now. Unit testing. Unit testing is for deterministic behavior, for things that are always going to behave the same every single time. That's fine. Don't need to worry about doing this kind of evaluation that I'm going to talk about here for deterministic behavior. Because you can write unit tests, software engineers know how to do unit tests, it's a very well-established practice. We're also not going to talk about things about security for the most part, a little bit, but not that much. And we're not going to talk about network behavior, uptime, latency, things like that. Those are sort of external to the LLM itself, but once again, do still evaluate these things, do still measure these things, they're still important, just not for right this minute. So what we are going to talk about, we're going to talk about how you really determine how well the LLM has completed a task. Not just in the abstract. We're going to talk about real examples. I'm going to give you some explanation that I hope will help with that. Also, we're going to talk about how you actually then put this into a production setting. What do you do? Because it's all good and well for someone to tell you, you should be evaluating your LLMs in every context, or you should be making sure that you're doing this, and if you're not, you're doing it wrong. But if you haven't been taught how to do it, or if it hasn't been explained, I feel like that's a little unfair. So I'm going to try and really spend some time explaining how to do it in this context. I should also mention, I forgot to mention earlier, if you go to my website at the bottom and go to the speaker section, all these slides are there. So some of this is a little bit text heavy, a little bit long. You can just view the slides right there and follow along on your own. So, next step, LLM as a judge. Some of you will already be familiar with this concept, but I want to give it a little bit of an overview just in case it's unfamiliar to anybody. This is the idea that you're deploying an LLM for whatever context, whether it's an agentic process or something more simple, and you will, instead of having a human being go through every response the LLM has generated and check it for quality and for the criteria that we're going to talk about, you have another LLM kind of doing that evaluation for you. These should be independent as much as possible. So that independence may mean that you need to have an LLM trained by a different provider, maybe a self-hosted, maybe you pull up Llama, something like that, if you're using an LLM foundational model that's from Anthropic or OpenAI. There's lots of choices, but ideally you don't want Claude to be monitoring Claude itself. Because those are trained on the same data source, they're going to have some slight biases, maybe not so slight, in favor of the responses that LLM provides. So if you want the cleanest evaluation, you want to have two LLMs that are from a different place. There's also, I think, it's important to mention that there's not really, it's not going to be low effort on the front end. We're not talking about, you grab one LLM, you grab another LLM, throw them at each other, and you can go, knock off early for the day. There's actually going to be a lot of work involved for the humans getting this set up and structured, but we're going to go over exactly how that works. And as any of those of us in the room from machine learning backgrounds know, monitoring is forever. The day you stop monitoring and evaluating your model is the day that your model is no longer in production and you're no longer using it. Sometimes I use the example of having a new puppy. You can put it out there, but it might make mistakes, and you should always be watching. You can't just let it go. So, with that, let's talk about exactly how you do this, though. And there's a question that might come up, like, oh, God, that's going to be a lot of work. Got to create two LLMs for the whole thing. We're going to have to deploy them. Why don't we just have human beings do this? And there are trade-offs, right? It's not that either one of these choices, the LLM or the human evaluator, is a free lunch. The only thing that's free is doing nothing. And doing nothing means that you go back to your customers, your guinea pig, and they're doing the testing for you, and that's bad news. Human evaluation does give you really precise control over what is evaluated and how. Like your human users are the best, proxy for what your customers are going to be seeing and what your customers are going to think. So if you've got human beings in your organization who can do this evaluation, experts who built the models ideally, they'll give you the best, measure of whether it's going well. However, those people could be doing other things at your organization. They're going to be very busy. They don't scale the same way an LLM can scale. And that's really the key problem with using human evaluation. As an LLM, as a judge, that removes a little bit of control. You're kind of taking a proxy step back, and you're saying, LLM, I trust you to do this, and we'll talk about how you get to that point of trust. It still costs money, though. Tokens are not cheap, and they're not free, and we are learning that more and more day after day as we read the news. but you can scale it essentially infinitely. So we're trying to find this balance between the scale that we need to be able to achieve when we're deploying models in a production setting, but also the quality control, the control over how the evaluation actually works. So, if any of you read my ODSC blog post that was sort of the the hype for this talk, you'll know that it was all about preparation. It wasn't actually about the evaluation process itself. It was all about what you have to do in advance. And what's important about this is that unless you understand the goal of your LLM and what it's supposed to do, you can't get another LLM to understand it. And if any of you were at the keynote yesterday evening from Jonathan from Databricks, you kind of heard this same message, right? You need to know what the purpose is, what a good response looks like, what success looks like, before you can get anybody, human or otherwise, to be able to evaluate this on your behalf. So you need to know, like, what is this for? Why are we doing this? And if you don't know, then you shouldn't be deploying an LLM, to be honest. Like, you shouldn't be deploying anything that you don't understand the business objective for and the goals that you hope to achieve. And then when you get to asking those questions, thinking about those questions, you get to a better sense of understanding what it is you're here for and what this project is about internally, and then you can move on to actually doing the evaluation process. So once we got that done, we're going to start talking about rubrics. And this might sound kind of rudimentary or a little tedious, but I promise this is super important for the process that we're going to go through. So, as I talked about earlier, I used to be a teacher. I used to teach students at a university, undergrads, and I taught sociology. So we had a lot of essay writing to do. Students had to write a lot of essays for me, and I was old school, so they wrote them in blue books by hand for their essay exams. And I had to grade those things, and a stack of blue books is a lot of grading, right? So one of the things that I found really important for this, both for my peace of mind, but also for the students to be able to understand what's going on, is to create rubrics ahead of time. Rubrics based on what are the learning outcomes I want these students to achieve, and how is this essay going to help me know whether they achieve them or not, okay? So that's exactly the kind of process that I'm bringing to this. We're creating a rubric so that the LLM that is evaluating, doing the grading, has an explicit, specific understanding of what counts as a good answer and what counts as a bad answer. So you, as the person who's just spent a long time figuring out what is this for, what is this project about, what are my business objectives, you're also going to design a rubric that's going to break these things down and specify what they mean. This reduces any subjectivity or sort of vibes-based stuff going on, and it makes sure that your actual measurement, your evaluation is going to make sense for that business goal. It also really helps because you can decide what matters to you and what doesn't. So if I'm teaching sociology, I don't really care that much about the spelling and grammar, especially when I'm making them write it in blue books, as long as I can understand what they're trying to say, we're fine. If I was teaching English, on the other hand, this would be a different question. So there's different criteria that matter to me because of what my learning objectives are for the students, and there are different objectives that will matter to you based on the business goals that really are important for this LLM for you. So, 3-step process. We've already done number 1. We understand the problem that our task LLM is solving. We determine what is important to us, what matters, what doesn't, done all of that. Then we need to break down what a good answer looks like into measurable components, right? We need to break them down into the things that we can plot into sort of a rubric grid. And then we're going to quantify. We're going to break those into actual numerical categories of the worst to the best, and we're going to design this rubric, and I'm going to walk through a brief example of exactly how that works. So what problem is my LLM solving? For my example, the user uploads a transcript and we're going to summarize it. I just made up an example for the purposes of this. We know what a good answer looks like. Brief text, no hallucinations, not adding extra stuff, not missing stuff, not attributing things to the wrong speaker, so on and so forth. You can make this as long as you want, pick the things that matter to you. And what are the key components, right? It needs to be accurate, it needs to include action items if there were any, not add things that weren't said and so on. And then we can create a rubric. We can start with, on the left side, 1 is the worst, 1 is you did not get it, right? And then you count up as many levels as makes sense to you up to, I don't know, I've got 5s on here, but you wouldn't necessarily need to go that high. You could do 1, 2, 3, whatever. And that 5 should be the best possible, meeting absolutely every objective. You got it right. And so you design a rubric like this and play around with it to make these criteria make sense for your LLM, what it's supposed to be doing. You don't necessarily need to have this many criteria. Maybe you have tons more. It's totally up to you. But once you've designed this, then we can get into the code. So this is the implementation you would use for deep eval if you're using what's called the G-eval framework, which is basically customization of your evaluation rubric. And so you can name it whatever you want. In this case, I've used the contradictions criteria that was on our little transcript over here. The response contains no contradictions with the transcript, right? And so give the criteria. You ask your evaluator LLM to figure out exactly whether any of the actual output contradicts the retrieval context. You give it in these evaluation parameters, you tell it you're going to give the actual output, and then you're going to give it the context, whatever the information is that you have available for it to determine what contradictions. In this case, it would be the transcript. And then you itemize your rubric criteria. You give it the numbers, you give it the values of the descriptions of what actually happened, and then you've got your own custom rubric that's going to measure the things that you care about, and you can just plug this into your coding workflow. There's lots of examples that you can use this for all kinds of different things. I've thrown in a few examples here. One of the ones that I like to highlight is refusal, because it's about what the LLM doesn't say, which I think is really handy. A lot of times you'll have an LLM deployed into a context where the user is going to be able to ask all kinds of questions and go with, people will play with these things. They'll try to ask more things than are necessarily relevant. And in a lot of cases, you want your LLM to say, no, I cannot give you a recipe for souffle, I'm sorry. You want it to know when it's supposed to find its own boundaries and stop. And the refusal question, you can say, did the model refuse to answer the question as it was instructed to do? That will help a great deal. So this is just a broad stretch of things you can do. But now we've got a rubric. We know what our model is supposed to do. We've figured out how to break that down into criteria that matter to us, and we've designed a rubric that can actually do it. We have the code, great. But now how do we actually do it? Because this is one thing. We've written the rubric, we are not done. I want to be very, very clear, we're not done. We have to do something called calibration now. And I like to say this is sort of a flow, but it's also sort of cycles back in on itself, which is so true to how machine learning works all the time, What we're going to start with is a validation sample. So this is sample responses or prompts and response pairs that are widely varying in quality, right? You don't want these to all be good ones. You don't want this to be the prompt was X and the model did a perfect job and answered it perfectly. You need to have some that are bad, some that are terrible, because you want to know that your evaluation LLM can tell the difference between the good ones and the bad ones. So you want to create these, and these will be synthetic sample text, or you would create these yourself, make sure that you're getting that diversity of quality, and make sure that they resemble production data, make sure that they look similar to what you're going to see in the wild, but stretch those outliers out a little bit. Find some of the weird stuff that you think you might encounter, or think your LLM might encounter, so that you're really getting a broad spectrum. Then this is part where there's a little bit of human effort involved. You take your rubric, which you just wrote, and you grade them all yourself. You gotta score them all yourself based on what you actually think you want the LLM to do, basically. What would you want the LLM to score these things? And so for the bad ones, it should be, a 1, and whatever criteria, and on the good ones, you want a 5, and we go that way. Then you ask your evaluator LLM with those same validation samples to start trying. Just give it a chance to score based on the rubric, based on the way that we've just formatted it, and then you take a look at how different it got. Because we've written our rubric the way that it makes sense to us as humans, and that we understand the text of the way that we wrote it. So, getting back to this, we wrote the expected outcome in very, human-friendly language. That might not work for your evaluator LLM. You might need to change the rubric. You might need to change how exactly you describe what you like and don't like, and what you want and don't want, to make sure that those criteria start to match. Because the real standard is whether the LLM does what you would do if you were in that situation, more or less. So think of back to our teaching example. If I had a TA and I wanted them to grade all those blue books because I haven't got time for that, I'm going to have that TA grade some samples. So I'm going to have them look at it, grade some samples, and say, did they do what I would do if I was doing the grading myself? And make sure that we're calibrated so that I can trust them to go off and do it. And if we get there and everything is working right, fabulous. If we're not, we've got to figure out what's different. We've got to figure out what we're misunderstanding between each other about what's not right or what is right about a particular response. So that's why we have the cycle. We're looping back. So we're going to say, okay, well, maybe we need to change these prompts. Maybe the rubric needs a little adjustment. We need to figure something out. Then, once you get to the point where you and the LLM, the evaluator LLM can agree, then we're good. Then we can move forward. So, once we got to that point, we got a few more steps. Because we need to do an end-to-end calibration, which is very similar to what I was just talking about, but instead of using our validation sample, our synthetic sample, now we need to go in and get the actual task LLM to really generate responses. We start, ideally sample cases from, beta test users would be a great example for this. Just have the task LLM start doing some stuff and have, once again, get out your pencil and start grading, and then have the evaluator LLM do some grading and make sure that that calibration is still holding true all the way through. You don't have to do a ton of this, especially if the calibration seems pretty good because we've spent time in the calibration process. But prompt it, make sure that everything's still aligned, keep an eye on that. Then, now you can deploy it. Now you're ready. So when the task LLM is in production, I really recommend having the evaluator LLM score output if you can swing the cost, have it evaluate every response, and then you can start putting that in a dashboard so you know the quality of every response your LLM is producing without you having to be worrying about it in the middle of the night. You can sleep easy knowing that someone is checking the results. Now that is not necessarily feasible for all organizations because that is doubling token costs more or less. That can get serious. So sampling is also an option. You can sample from the prompts that your task LLM is seeing, pass those to your evaluation LLM. And if you start to see something screwy going on, if your task LLM is behaving weirdly in a way that you're not expecting, then you can go back and run more comprehensive tests, run more comprehensive sort of evaluations with your evaluator LLM. But keep an eye on that. Now you can monitor the scores, you can monitor the average scores, you can monitor the scores on individual rubric elements. That way you'll know when your task LLM is getting a little bit wild and you know when to go back and check it out. And I also recommend recalibrating occasionally, because first, your vision of what a correct answer or the best possible answer is might change. That's possible. Your business needs might change, your objectives might change, but also you just want to make sure that everything is still behaving the way you expected, because sometimes your foundation models might be shifting, the data quality might be shifting, stuff can happen. So there's other things you can do after this. We're not done yet. We can keep doing more stuff. You don't have to. We've gotten to the point where we've got an evaluation framework in place and it's working pretty well. However, you can use evaluator scores as quality gate. So you can say, task LLM did stuff, evaluator LLM reviewed that stuff. Before you actually return that response to the customer, you can have your evaluator LLM take a look and say, yeah, this one's not that good. Let's make the task LLM try again. So you can just build in that sort of, it's a feedback loop that works without your customer having to see a potentially low quality response, and that can work really nicely. If you're using an agentic chain, like we do at Nebula, we have lots of LLMs in agentic, sub-agent flows. You can put one on each different LLM, which means that you can find the weak link in your larger agentic workflow if one is particularly behaving badly. You're not just limited with what did the last response out to the customer look like. You can find if somewhere in there it's picking the wrong tool or it's missing context or stuff is going awry. So it really helps to demystify some of the processes inside a larger agentic workflow. You can use those evaluator scores in prompt engineering for your task LLM. So this means that if you notice that through the evaluation scores, your task LLM is always doing, it's always got the wrong tone of voice or something for these last responses, or it's always it's not refusing to answer the things it's supposed to refuse to answer. That might tell you that there's system prompting that needs to change, that there's prompt engineering that needs to be done on the task LLM side, and so you can use that as sort of a feedback loop there. Finally, you can actually go ahead and just go full force and use reinforcement learning with AI feedback to tune your task LLM automatically using this evaluator LLM feedback, which is pretty neat. And I've put a link at the very end for anybody who's interested in more of that. We'll get into it today. Finally, protect your evaluator criteria, because this is one of the things that is important in the cybersecurity kind of space. If your criteria is well known or obvious, bad actors who want to do insertion of unwanted behavior in your data will be able to create like malicious activity using your LLM without you noticing, because they'll be able to work around the criteria that you've set. If they know, well, they're looking for, refusal behavior, so make sure that the malicious prompts that you put into this LLM don't trigger that flag. They can get malicious activity around your rubric, so protect your criteria, make sure that that's not out there in the world. Finally, before we go, I want to revisit the point that it's important to care. It's important to care about evaluation. LLM evaluation really does matter, and AI generally really does matter, because customers you don't want to be your guinea pigs. LLMs and AI generally are as unpopular as Congress right now. It's terrible. People are not going to give you the benefit of the doubt, and you don't have the same kind of goodwill with customers when you're using AI as you might have had a year ago. So making sure it works right the first time, it does what it's supposed to do, and it provides customers the value they're expecting, really, really does matter. It matters for your customer relationships, for the success of your business. And so make sure that you're keeping an eye on it, because AI is always going to make mistakes. It's probabilistic. It's non-deterministic. This is statistics. We know perfect is not an option, not a choice. So we need to notice the mistakes, notice the issues, notice the errors first before anyone else does. Get in, fix those, and get it done. So a few links. As I said, everything is on my website. If you go to the website and hit the speaking tab, then you'll be able to see these links. But there's some frameworks. There's a course on Maven that I personally took, a friend of mine, that I really recommend if you're interested in getting more hands-on practical LLM evaluation deployment experience. Otherwise, thank you very much for your time, and I'll take questions.